Has accomplished something now that no other former U.S. president has. He turned 100 today, and the White House is celebrating with the display. Carter served one term in the White House from 1977 to 1981, during which he presided over the Camp David Accords that ended years of conflict between Israel and Egypt, made human rights integral to U.S. foreign policy, took a hard line against the Soviet Union. He entered hospice February of last year. It's been a year and a half now. He's been growing weaker, though, in recent months, but he told relatives he wants to hang on till at least October 15th. It's about 2 weeks when early voting begins in Georgia, so he can cast his ballot in that 2024 presidential race. Today,